What are your thoughts, Chris, on this recent controversy with Balenciaga? I don't know how much you've looked into it, but what are your
I've
thoughts on
only
that?
looked at it superficially, Zuby, so I'm not an expert on it exactly, except that I've seen, these advertising campaigns pop up occasionally over the years that are, borderline exploitive, that, seem to take advantage of children in one way or the other. Sometimes the over sexualization of children goes back for, decades. And I think there's a corporate citizen responsibility to this that we should go overboard not to exploit children in any way.
Hmm.
And especially when it comes to human trafficking issues or the sexual exploitation of children or the blackmailing of children. And it just, if you're going to make a judgment call, go to the side of being safe on it because there's nothing good. I mean, yeah, you generate a controversy. Potentially, it adds to sales. It makes me uncomfortable
Hmm.
when corporations do that.
Yeah, I think there are some concerning lines being blurred between children and adults in recent years. I think I know certainly growing up, regardless of where you are, which society in the West, there was always a clear, hard line, a delineation between children and adults when it comes to laws, when it comes to ability to consent, when it comes
Yeah,
to when it's appropriate to be exposed to certain types of information or imagery and so on. And from various areas, both institutional and sort of social and cultural, I'm seeing this line being increasingly blurred. And I find that deeply concerning. People are now saying and advocating that children can consent to things that typically only adults would be able to. So the line is being blurred there. I think when it comes to online imagery, children have access to, you can just type in a website and tick a box saying that you're over 18. You don't need to, and children have access to all of this stuff that they didn't have before. And I'm also seeing a disturbing increase in the mainstream media in particular to, and it sounds so crazy to say it, but to normalize pedophilia or to get people to sympathize with it. There's a play that just came out recently, which the New York Times was raving about. The whole play is about pedophilia, and it's should we have sympathy for these people? I'm sure you've heard the term MAP or minor
sure.
attracted person, which is supposed to somewhat destigmatize this whole idea. So I'm seeing this amalgamation of all these different things happening, and I find it I find it very concerning. I'm not sure how much it's on most people's radar because it's so uncomfortable to talk about, and most people don't want to connect these certain dots. But I'm seeing a lot of this over the years, and it
Well,
seems like
I think Zuby, that's valid. I mean,
yeah,
in historically, if you look back at NAMBLA, the North American Man Boy Love Association, which is a group that would try to normalize pedophilia between adult males and boys, the FBI had been investigating that group for years and had pretty much run it down to nothing until the internet. And
hmm,
suddenly it's going strong, and they've got these cruises, and they're trying to rekindle this offensive organization. And when you talk about maps, I mean that you can't normalize something that is just absolutely wrong on every level. It's legally wrong. It's morally reprehensible. A child is a child, and a child needs to be protected in our society from a lot of different things. First and foremost, violence and sexual violence, and then when it comes to all the things we know about labor and making sure that child has health care and education. So any attempt to normalize the relationship between a child and adult is just wrong. It's offensive, it's illegal. Consent cannot be given at that early age. And so whether you convince somebody to say yes or not has no bearing on whether or not this is ethical or appropriate. It's wrong on every level. And I know what you're talking about, the maps thing. And I've talked to therapists, psychiatrists who go into prisons and they interview predators and pedophiles. And what they will say routinely when there's nothing for them to lose, when they're being absolutely honest with a guy like, Michael Berg, who works for the U.S. Marshal's Office, they will tell them two things. One, the time they got caught was not their first time offending. They had offended 2, 3, 4 other times. Two, almost universally, there's a link between the viewing of child pornography and offending. And those are things you just can't get around. So when you talk about, is it better for a predator, pedophile to view child pornography and get his fix there as opposed to going out and offending? No, because the viewing leads to offending. And we know that. The viewing of child pornography, every time an image of child pornography is viewed, it's another incident of abusing that child, of exploiting that child in that image. So there's no way, I think, that you can normalize it or justify it or rationalize it or certainly legalize it, because it's not even a slippery slope. It's a wall that should be built there to protect children. And I'm adamant about that. And I think most everybody agrees with me. I mean, I think these people barking about maps and we need to understand this, it's such a tiny minority percentage of the human population. They tend to get attention because I think it's just so awful and offensive to even try to make that argument.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it's a tiny minority, but something that we've certainly seen in the last few decades is that
it gets attention because it's outrageous and offensive, and that rises to the level of attention. And also, if people are trying to argue this, they should be exposed. I think. I mean, I'm not going to give them, a ton of attention. I don't think it deserves it. It's wrong. I don't think they should give them a chance to even try to normalize this.
Absolutely. What about this situation that seems to be happening in the U.S. in particular states? I've noticed California, for one. I'm assuming it exists in other states as well. But people being let off very, very lightly or being released early from prison for some of these crimes.
Well, I think we've seen that change a little bit in the early investigations we did, especially in the first one we did in California, or one of the ones we did in California, in Long Beach particularly. The local judge there sort of viewed this as a TV sting operation or a reality show. So the guys who were caught in that particular sting mostly received a slap on the wrist, probation and registration as a sex offender, and very few of those guys in that investigation served time. And it led to a big sense of outrage across the country. I testified in front of Congress shortly thereafter, and I had U.S. senators, in the hallways of the U.S. Capitol, asking, "What do we do?" And my advice then, and not that I'm a legal constitutional scholar by any means, but my advice was that each case is different. You can't necessarily have one policy across the board, but you do have to have basic minimum levels of punishment to create deterrence. And so if a guy is arguing that, well, it was a decoy, it wasn't a regular kid, well, guess what? If I wasn't there, if my crew wasn't there, if law enforcement wasn't there, and a child was there, there would have been a sexual assault. I know this based upon the reading of the transcripts. So yeah, it was on television. Yeah, it was a sting operation, but that doesn't mean a crime wouldn't have been committed. And there are statistics that will suggest that every time a guy is caught in one of these stings, you are preventing exponentially, perhaps dozens of other kids from getting exposed to this, because their arrest is a deterrence. Now, people always ask, who these guys are, and I'm not a therapist, and I'm not necessarily qualified to tell you exactly the psychiatric background. But from my experience, you have three categories. You've got the hardcore heavy hitters, these guys who would be doing this with or without the internet. They're going to be the bad little league coach, the guy who seeks out vulnerable children at the movie theater, the food court at the mall, wherever children gather. And those guys can't be fixed. They should be locked up and monitored. There's a younger group of guys who are opportunists, who are socially inept, who have a hard time developing an intimate relationship. And they are in their late teens, early 20s, and they look for vulnerable boys and girls. And they figure, well, if something works out, it's a Romeo Juliet thing. And at some point, we'll all be in the right age group, and there's not an issue there. It's illegal, it's wrong. But those guys can probably get some sort of minor punishment and counseling and not reoffend. And then there's this interesting group in the middle, the doctors we've seen, the clergymen we've seen, the cops we've seen, who have a desire to have a sexual relationship with a child, but probably wouldn't act on it without the internet, the access, the anonymity, the addictive nature of it. And those guys are the more vexing category. Because it's more complicated. They don't have the word predator tattooed across their forehead. They could be the guy standing next to you at the grocery store on a Saturday morning. And that's the real challenge of this. And we want one size fits all answers to this problem. And there's certainly a lot of good work going on in this area on the part of therapists. And I've talked to these people and I've seen amazing stories of how people turn their lives around who engage in this sort of activity. But yet it's not a very glamorous part of medicine, is it? If you spend $200,000 on medical school, do you want to be on Park Avenue as a plastic surgeon, or do you want to be going into federal prisons with Michael Burke interviewing hardcore sex offenders? I get it. Yeah. I don't know that I have the answer to it, but I certainly see the complex nature of the vexing issue.